now where at least 104 Palestinians have been killed in a wave of Israeli strikes in Gaza. The Israeli military said it struck dozens of terror targets and terrorists in response to violations by Hamas of the U.S. brokered ceasefire deal. Israel's defense minister accused Hamas of an attack in Gaza that killed an Israeli soldier and of breaching the terms on returning deceased hostage bodies. Hamas said it had no connection to the attack and that Israel was lying to undermine the deal. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump maintained nothing would jeopardize the ceasefire, but added that Israel should hit back when its soldiers are targeted. We're now joined by Dr. Ahmed Jazbhay, political commentator on Afro-Middle East matters from the University of South Africa. A very good evening to you, Dr. Jazbhay. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Sapisa. Good evening to listeners.
What do you make of this latest wave of deadly attacks on Gaza?
The ceasefire agreement that was signed earlier this month merely transitioned from a full-blown genocide to what Ilan Papp referred to many years as an incremental genocide. So it's merely a slow form of genocide that we have returned to. Regarding the most recent incidents of yesterday, Hamas has denied responsibility for any attack on Israeli soldiers. We do know that last week there was an incident where 2 soldiers were killed, and it was later found out, and Americans have agreed with this assessment, that an Israeli military bulldozer ran over an unexploded ordnance. We do know that there's 30,000 pounds of unexploded ordnance all over Gaza. So right now, Hamas has denied responsibility. Israel is looking for any opportunity to return to full-scale war, given that 82% of Israelis supported the war in Gaza. But it appears that American pressure is stopping a full-blown return to war, despite, yesterday 104 being killed and about 200 being killed in the past month since the war supposedly has ended. So we are still in a state of war, a de facto state of war, in my opinion. But it appears that American pressure is forcing Israel's hand to return to the ceasefire earlier today.
It's interesting when you say we are still in a state of war, Dr. Jazbhay, where many commentators have been very critical of using the term war, saying that there is a disproportionate use of power from Israel to Gaza, and the fact that we're not talking about equals. Can you just explain to me conceptually your choice of, or ideologically, your terms, your use of those terms, and what your sense is about if we're saying one Israeli soldier was killed and we're talking about over 100 killed as a result of the airstrikes by Israel?
Yeah, very, very simply, I argue that Palestine has been in a paradigm of war since the Nakba of 1940, the Nakba being the catastrophe. So a state of war has not ended. It has been going on for the last 78 years. So which is why I call it a paradigm of war, and which is why we are in a state of war. Palestine has always been in a state of war, despite there being unequals. You have the 4th largest and most powerful army in the world, and compared to Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, which have basic weapons, homemade weapons, some AK-47s and so on, and they've repurposed a lot of unexploded weaponry and ordnance from the Israeli war. So it is a power imbalance, but nonetheless there's a paradigm of war that has been going on. Okay. And Israeli anti-Zionist Jewish scholar Ilan Papp, as I mentioned earlier, referred to this as an incremental genocide. So we've been through a full-blown genocide for for the past 2 years, and now we've returned to a state of an incremental genocide, a genocide nonetheless, as anti-Zionist scholars Norman Finkelstein, Stephen Friedman, Shlomo Sand, and others have agreed that this is a genocide, but we have returned to a state of an incremental genocide within what I call a paradigm of war. So it is a war, but an unequal war.
Okay, so we have seen I find it even interesting that we continue to talk about this as a ceasefire and even use the word agreement, because looking at President Donald Trump's own declaration that Israel has a right to retaliate if Hamas breaches the terms of the ceasefire. And as we mentioned, Hamas denying that it is responsible for the attack on the Israeli soldier. Can we really talk about a ceasefire given the fact that the attacks have not ended? And the United States that should be brokering peace does not seem like it is offering equal grace on both sides.
So, this is a continuation of war by other means. This is a ceasefire, and it's always been like this. It is the same situation in Lebanon. It is the same situation in other areas, other wars in which Israel is involved in. It seems that the indigenous people ceases, and Israel continues to fire. Israel still controls around, I think it is 58%, if my memory serves me correct, of Gaza, and there's a so-called yellow line that within which Palestinians cannot cross, and then it becomes a free-for-all. So this is not a ceasefire, so to speak. It is a temporary reprieve. Even so, 200 odd have died since the so-called ceasefire. 3 Israeli soldiers have died, but those circumstances are disputed. So this is why I say I return to the idea of the paradigm of war. Palestine is experiencing this ongoing paradigm of war since 1948. What we have now is a lull in the scale of the killing. The genocide continues, but not at the scale in which it did for 2 years, for almost 2 years. So the biggest victors in this, what we must understand, and this is, it comes down to this, the majority of Israelis support the genocide. The majority of Israelis support the war. And then you got the internal dynamics of Israel. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the hardliners within the right-wing coalition of Israel, they want this war to continue by any and all means. So they are putting pressure on it internally. And that's another dynamic. Whilst the Americans, the Qataris, the Egyptians, and so on are putting pressure on the Americans to ensure that the ceasefire holds, because, and it is Trump that is just avoiding, to be honest, and I'm not saying Trump is a good guy, don't get me wrong about this, but it is Trump that is ensuring that Israel does not return to a full scale of war. And then within America, you have AIPAC. AIPAC is putting pressure on Trump as well. So we are in a paradigm of war. We are in a lull in the fighting, if I can say, but not a ceasefire, and definitely not a peace plan, as Trump would like us to believe.
And this has become a major focus of international debate, what is happening in Gaza. You spoke about the Egyptians, you spoke about the Qataris. What are they empowered to do just in terms of peace mechanisms? Can they effect some sort of intervention that will quell tensions at all?
The Qataris and the Gulf Arab nations had 2 years to invoke the leverage that they had. The only reason, and I would say that the only reason there is a ceasefire is because of the attack on Qatar in early September. And this really spooked the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis. the Egyptians, because if Qatar, a major non-NATO US ally, could be attacked, who's next? I mean, we know Jordan and Egypt are not really strong countries and unable to stand up to Israel, and that really spooked them. So they used that leverage to stop the genocide in Gaza. They could have used leverage that they had. Remember, the Qataris have given Trump a $400 million plane, another $1 trillion worth of investment. So did the Emiratis, so did the Saudis as well. So, but they only used that leverage when their thrones were in jeopardy. So the Qataris host Hamas, and I believe that Palestinians to some extent are grateful for that. But it's clear that it's only when their thrones were at jeopardy that they decide to invoke the leverage. They didn't invoke that leverage when they really could. And the same applies for much of the other Gulf Arab countries. They worried about themselves first as opposed to the Palestinians. So it appears largely, and I believe Hamas understands this, that they are on their own. The Palestinians as a whole are on their own. And in the long term, Palestinians are on their own, and the Qataris and so on will only invoke leverage that they have for a ceasefire when their interests and their thrones are affected.
So this continued bombardment of Gaza, albeit, as you say, at a lessened rate, what does Israel have to gain out of it while posturing that it is actually in talks about a cessation of hostilities? Is it to weaken Hamas? Can it technically weaken Hamas if Hamas is resolute that the scales are obviously tipped against them, that they're not responsible for these attacks, and that they are keeping to the terms of the deal?
I think it comes down to internally within Israeli society. I've mentioned this, that 82%, and this is a statistic that is from Haaretz. Haaretz is a so-called liberal Israeli newspaper, English language newspaper, and 82% of Israelis supported the genocide in Gaza. And now remember that the ruling coalition is baying for blood. Ben-Gvir's party, who is the the finance minister and a de facto governor of the occupied West Bank, Ben-Gvir, who's the state security minister, and the other right-wingers within the Israeli parliament are baying for blood. Their supporters are baying for blood. They want this to continue. So these continued attacks at a slower scale and pace are meant to satisfy that part of Israeli society. Those who oppose the genocide are a small minority. Those who were protesting in so-called Hostage Square in Tel Aviv every Saturday were only protesting because, because they had a vested interest in this. They had their loved ones in Gaza. Now they appear to be supporting the war. So internally within Israeli society, they want no Palestinians. They want the maximum amount of land with the most minimum amount of Palestinians. They want the so-called Greater Israel Project, which encompasses all of historic Palestine, parts of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, as well as parts of Iran. This is what they want. Ultimate goal is the Greater Israel Project. The majority of Israelis support this Greater Israel Project. And these continued attacks on Gaza are meant to some extent satisfy that portion, to that majority of Israel society that says that, we want this Greater Israel Project. So Netanyahu is saying, we haven't forgotten about this. That remains the ultimate goal, the Greater Israel. We must understand that Israel is a very small country in terms of size. It can fit in the Kruger National Park 4 times. That's how small it is. And it needs extra space or extra land, which is why they want to continue on this path of the Greater Israel Project. Lebanon is neutralized. Syria is neutralized even under the new leadership. Iraq is neutralized. Iran is strong but wounded. We know Jordan, the less said, the better. It's a very weak country. Egypt has a strong military, but it's unlikely to be able to withstand an Israeli assault. So it is about the internal dynamics as well as the Greater Israel Project.
And finally, just the invocation of the word apartheid in relation to the Palestinian experience, given its the bombardment by Israel. What is the impact of that on the global narrative, particularly on the legitimacy of the solidarity movements like South Africa that support the Palestinians in Gaza?
I think this, the apartheid slur, as I like to call it, is something that we understand that Israel does not use apartheid in the way South Africa used it. There's no form of petty apartheid like the Mixed Marriages Act and and other sort of acts as this. These are more institutional and systemic forms of apartheid. They have their uses in terms of certain arguments and to convince people that what we experience in Palestine is a form of apartheid. But I've always argued that Israel is willing to live with that label of apartheid because its goal is genocide. Its goal is ethnic cleansing. So to refer to apartheid, apartheid was a serious crime in South Africa, but ethnic cleansing and wide-scale ethnic cleansing and genocide was not part of the agenda. Well, at least not at that particular time. But for Israel, it's about ethnic cleansing and genocide. So the solidarity, it has certain uses in order to get people to understand part of the nature of oppression, but the real problem here is settler colonialism, Zionist settler colonialism, and what Shlomo Sand referred to as the elimination, or rather the logic of elimination. In South African apartheid, there was no logic of elimination. It was to subdue the native. In Palestine, in Zionist settler colonialism, it is about eliminating the native through this logic of elimination. So it has its uses, but what we are dealing with, and this is not to belittle our experience as South Africans, is something far more serious. It's about ethnic cleansing. It is about genocide in Palestine.
Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us. Dr. Ahmed Jazbhay, who is a political commentator on the Afro-Middle East matters.